The morning of April 25th, 2010 began like any other Sunday in St. Paul's Highland Park neighborhood, a place defined by quiet streets and the unspoken code of Minnesota nice. At 6:30 a.m., that peace was shattered by a voice on the line with a state patrol dispatcher. Heidi Firkus, her words laced with terror, reported that someone was trying to break into her home at 1794 Minnehaha Avenue. She was giving her address, trying to get the words out, when a loud, sudden noise erupted through the phone. Then silence. The dispatcher lost her. Approximately 65 seconds later, a second call came in. This time, it was Heidi's husband, Nick Firkus, reporting that he and his wife had both been shot. When first responders arrived, they found a scene that would launch a 14-year mystery. Heidi was dead in the kitchen, a shotgun blast to the back. Nick was wounded in the leg, transported to Regions Hospital. The shotgun lay in the foyer. Nick's initial account was simple. An intruder had broken in, a struggle over the weapon occurred, and the gun discharged. But from the very beginning, the simplicity of that story was at odds with the complexity of what officers found when they walked through the front door. Just feet away from the Firkus house, a young man named Brandon O'Connor was house-sitting, tasked with caring for a litter of kittens. He had been asleep when the sound of the animals moving around woke him. Something else caught his attention, a muffled argument coming through the open window of the house next door. He paused, listening, trying to make out the words. Then he heard what he believed were gunshots. But it was what came next that would become a pivotal piece of the case. Brandon heard a voice, agonized and desperate, crying out, "You shot her! You shot me! Please, please, no!" Then silence again. For years, this testimony would become a central point of contention. The defense would point to those words as definitive proof of a third person in the house that morning. If Nick was speaking to someone other than Heidi, they argued, then an intruder must have existed. The prosecution, however, offered a different interpretation. They suggested that Brandon, half awake, listening through a window, may have misheard Nick's panicked words during his 911 call. Nick had screamed on the phone with the dispatcher for nearly 7 minutes. The neighbor's recollection, they argued, was a misunderstanding shaped by the chaos of the moment. At the hospital, Sergeant Jim Gray of the St. Paul Police Department sat down with Nick Firkus to take his statement. Gray was an experienced investigator who had learned to trust his instincts. Nick recounted the morning, waking to the sound of someone fiddling with the door, retrieving the shotgun, loading it, waking Heidi, and instructing her to call 911. The couple had a plan, Nick explained. If there was ever an intruder, they would avoid a confrontation and escape through the garage to their car. But Gray's instincts began to stir when Nick described the sequence of their movement through the house. Heidi, unarmed, went down the stairs first, toward the very door where the threat was located. Why would a husband send his wife toward danger? Gray probed further, asking about the couple's life, their marriage, their finances. Nick revealed that they were being evicted the next day. They had lost their home to foreclosure. Gray noted the way Nick delivered this information, as a simple fact, with no apparent emotion. Then, an hour and 40 minutes into the conversation, Nick finally asked about Heidi. "I just want to know the final answer on Heidi," he said. The question, so casual and so delayed, struck Gray as profoundly abnormal. It was not the reaction of a grieving husband. When investigators executed a search warrant on the Firkus home later that day, they walked into a space that directly contradicted Nick's narrative. The house showed no evidence of a family preparing to move. The closets were full. The refrigerator was stocked with food. There were a few empty boxes in the dining room, but nothing packed, nothing labeled. No indication that anyone intended to vacate the premises within 24 hours. For a couple facing eviction, the scene was strangely static. Then they turned their attention to the foyer, where Nick claimed he had engaged in a life-or-death struggle with an armed intruder. On a nearby table sat a vase, a few receipts, a beer bottle. Everything was undisturbed. Not a single item had been knocked over. The physical evidence simply did not support the account of two men fighting for control of a shotgun in that confined space. They also examined the front door for signs of forced entry. There were markings on the wood, but nothing fresh, nothing that indicated a break-in had occurred that morning. The door had not been forced open. The physical evidence was telling a story that had no intruder in it. 5 days after Heidi's death, her family and friends gathered at Calvary Church to say goodbye. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion, the sanctuary filled with people who had loved the young woman, known for her warmth and her genuine spirit. Heidi's mentors from the church, Marcus and Kina Sarzan, stood in the receiving line. When they reached Nick, they extended their hands and offered their condolences. What they saw stopped them. There was no grief on his face, no tears, no visible emotion. It felt to them like he was simply going through emotion, fulfilling an obligation rather than mourning his wife. Marcus began asking other friends a question that felt almost unspeakable. Could Nick have done this? The answer from nearly everyone was a firm no. Nick loved Heidi. There was just no way. But Marcus could not shake what he had seen in the receiving line. He knew that people grieve differently. He knew that trauma manifests in unexpected ways. But the absence of emotion was so complete, so striking, that it lodged in his mind and would not leave. For years he would carry that image, waiting for answers that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. When Detective Nicole Sipes took over the cold case in 2019, she did something no investigator had done before. She built a complete financial timeline with the help of the FBI. What she uncovered was a portrait of a man living a double life. Nick and Heidi bought their home in 2007, a purchase that strained their $70,000 combined income to the breaking point. By the time Heidi died, Nick had not made a mortgage payment in 22 months. The house had gone to foreclosure. They were being evicted the day after the shooting. But Sipes found no evidence that Heidi knew any of this. She had not signed foreclosure paperwork. She had not attended the eviction hearing. Her texts and emails contained no mention of financial distress. She was scheduled to work on the Monday after she died, not something a woman planning to move would do. Sipes discovered that Nick had told Heidi they were victims of identity theft, claiming losses of nearly $200,000. It was a complete fabrication. The shame of financial failure, Sipes believed, was something Nick could not bear to reveal. He had built his reputation in his church community as a man of wisdom and integrity. The collapse of that image was, perhaps, a fate worse than anything else he could imagine. Nick Firkus remarried quickly after Heidi's death. Within 2 years, he had proposed to Rachel Sanchez, a woman who had been going through her own divorce. They bonded over their faith and the shared experience of trauma. Rachel saw Nick as steady, grounded, handling the tragedy of his first wife's death with remarkable composure. They had 3 children together. But over time, the same patterns began to emerge. Rachel discovered that Nick had hidden financial problems from her as well. She found a letter stating they had not paid their property taxes and were facing eviction. The realization was chilling. This was exactly what had happened with Heidi. Rachel began to question everything. In a secretly recorded conversation, she confronted him. "Your actions have caused me to just distrust you completely," she said. "The fact that your line was so easy for you to do in front of me over and over and over makes me think—" Nick finished her sentence, "that I could murder my wife." Rachel shared the recording with Detective Sipes. She later said that she felt a connection to Heidi, a woman she had never met. Heidi did not get to have a voice. Rachel hoped that hers could stand in its place. In January 2023, Nick Firkus finally faced a jury. The prosecution had a simple question at the heart of their case. Was there an intruder, or was there not? They presented an FBI-created animation showing the tiny entryway of the home. The animation demonstrated that a struggle between 2 men over a weapon in that space would have been impossible without disturbing the objects on the nearby table. The vase, the receipts, the beer bottle, all untouched. Then they turned to the 65 seconds. Heidi's 911 call ended with a loud noise. Nick's call began 65 seconds later. Prosecutor Rachel Crocker walked the jury through what could happen in that time. Shooting Heidi, checking her pulse, picking up the shotgun, shooting himself in the leg, misdialing 911 twice, and then finally connecting with a dispatcher. It was, she argued, more than enough time. The defense countered with the neighbor's testimony about hearing, "You shot me," arguing that proved a third person was present. They pointed to tool marks on the door as evidence of forced entry.
They argued that the 65-second timeline did not account for the misdials. The jury was left to decide which version of reality was more credible.
On February 10th, 2023, after 11 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. Deliberations lasted 5 hours. For Nick's friends, the speed of the verdict was a source of hope. One friend texted him, believing that such a quick decision could only mean an acquittal. They rushed to the courthouse. They were wrong. The jury found Nick Firkus guilty on 2 counts of murder, premeditated and intentional. In the courtroom, Heidi's friends and family felt the weight of 13 years lift. Justice had been slow, but it had arrived. The verdict meant that the narrative Nick had constructed, the intruder, the struggle, the tragic accident, had been officially rejected. The jury had looked at the evidence and concluded that there was no third person in that house. There was only Nick and Heidi. And in the foyer of their home, on a Sunday morning, he had ended her life. For those who had loved Heidi, the verdict was more than a legal outcome. It was an affirmation that what they had always felt in their hearts was true. The man who had smiled at her funeral, who had shaken their hands without a tear in his eye, had been carrying a secret that the jury had finally exposed. On April 13, 2023, Nick Firkus stood before Judge Leonardo Castro for sentencing. Heidi's brother, Peter Erickson, addressed the court. He spoke of growing up with Heidi as the quintessential little sister. He spoke of the lies told from the very day after her murder, lies that had made closure impossible. When Nick's turn came, he did not waver. "I do maintain and will maintain to my dying breath my innocence of this crime," he said. "My body stands condemned to serve another man's sentence, but my soul remains free." Judge Castro listened, then delivered the maximum sentence: life in prison without the possibility of release. "Good luck to you, sir," the judge said. "Godspeed." For Rachel, Nick's second wife, the aftermath was complicated. Her children had lost the father they thought they knew, and she thought of Heidi, the woman whose voice had been silenced. Heidi's friends reflected on the life she had lived, a life of genuine love, of loyalty, of making everyone feel welcome. She would not want bitterness to take root, they said. She would want people to choose to love regardless of circumstance. But on that Sunday morning, love was not what she found waiting for her in the foyer of her own home.